Hi everyone, I'm Cooper and this is Dawn. Thanks for giving us a chance to make this pitch. Basically what we would like to present to you today is an idea for a line of experiments that we're really keen to run over the next few years, and are really hoping that we could leverage the PSA to get involved and collaborate to develop these line of experiments. And the end goal really is to try and develop an evidence-based publishing system that we as a community would feel comfortable adopting, and hopefully would overcome some of the problems that we currently have in the scholarly publishing industry. So I can't really make that pitch without starting off with a brief slide about some of the problems that we have. And whenever I present a slide like this, I always feel like it's way too negative. So I tried to raise the tempo with some comics. It probably didn't work. But this comic here, this down the bottom here, is really the reason that I started getting interested in scholarly publishing. It was this kind of stark realization that I was being evaluated according to the significance of my results, as opposed to the quality of my methods. And so we know that there's this bias towards novelty and significance, and obviously more recently the replication crisis or reproducibility crisis is showing that this bias has a big effect on the literature more broadly. We also know that the system's pretty slow. It takes years to get published. The reviews that we do, according to this little image here, get thrown in the bin and don't get recognized. And we don't get rewarded for the reviews we do typically if they're done behind closed doors. And then of course everyone's aware of reviewer number 2. So there's this problem that reviews aren't generally accountable. And then this last point here is just kind of pointing out that the current system is incredibly expensive and not really controlled by researchers, but instead controlled by very profitable publishers, as per the bottom comic on the right. So without wasting any more time on the negatives, the exciting part is that there's all of these really futuristic visions for how communication could and should look in the future. And there's been no shortage of suggestions along these lines, and even people are developing platforms right now to sort of instantiate these in various formats. And so I've tried to highlight sort of 3 main features that I think are really great progressive features and kind of form the backbone of the proposal today. So the first is modularity. So everyone's familiar with registered reports. So the idea that research shouldn't just be evaluated at the end of the life cycle, but should also be evaluated after the design phase before data is collected. And these other 2 platforms that I've listed here, Octopus and Liberate Science, are kind of taking this idea to the next level. So rather than just having 2 stages of review, these platforms would suggest that we should be publishing research at every stage of the process. So say the literature review when we develop hypotheses, the protocol, collect data, and so on, and opening up that process to review throughout the community. The second point here is post-publication peer review. So this is the idea that we should have a kind of ongoing and dynamic review system rather than treating papers as a static record of events. And it's worth noting that this type of a format has been developed in some journals already, like F1000, Science Open is doing something along these lines, and PLOS ONE is talking about doing this. Pre-review is a really great platform where you can review any preprint out there. And the basic premise is that rather than kind of gating things prior to the journal, everything gets published and then evaluated by the community afterwards. So it goes some way towards addressing bias. And then this third point is numerical evaluation. So this is really a kind of extension of the post-publication peer review model. But under this model, preprints wouldn't just be reviewed after they're published, but they would also be evaluated and rated on some predefined set of metrics. So the premise here is that when reviewers and editors judge research, they're making some kind of set of value judgments on some unknown set of qualities that they prioritize. And really what this type of model tries to do or wants to do is just get those types of subjective decisions that people are making out on the table so that we can tap into that as a sort of rich data set. And then people could start to tailor the literature according to their own needs. So Krieger-Scorti talks about paper evaluation functions, where any user could come along and define their own filter based on this rich data set that we have on, you know, evaluation of research, and then start to really tailor what articles pop into their feed based on these filters. So again, there are some platforms that are doing these, that are doing numerical open evaluation in some kind of format. Some people are probably aware of replicats, which is a sort of slant on this idea, but it's getting people to rate the replicability of research. And this last one I put here is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I put up eBay because it strikes me as funny that all of these online platforms, whether it's eBay or Airbnb or you name it, have richer sets of metrics than we do in academia. In academia, we typically have the journal as a you know, metric for quality. And eBay at least lets you judge, you know, the speed of delivery, the quality of the product, communication, you know, on, you name it. There's like a set of metrics that people can rate. So basically, the point in this slide is to sort of highlight what features we could and should be driving towards, but also to highlight that these ideas have been around for quite a while and progress has been relatively slow. And this is kind of the crux of what this model that we're proposing tries to get around, which is try to address the social problems in adoption. So Nosek and Baranan said it well when they said that the critical barriers to change are not technical, they're social. And the fact that we already have technical implementations of these features in various formats is a good sign that we do have the technical proficiency. It's really a question of how do we get people to actually adopt these new platforms under the current context. And the main obstacle really is journal prestige, in my opinion. It's been written about as being a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's also, Parks wrote a paper back in 2002 that forecast that very little would change in the open access scene because of this highly interconnected collective action problem that we have that is centered around journal prestige. And unfortunately, in some degrees, he's been correct. But the basic problem with journal prestige is that it creates this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that you can see on the right. And the way it does that, the top side of the top circle in green highlights the sort of virtuous cycle. So there is some degree in which journal prestige does predict quality, purely for the fact that they get to select from a much larger set of articles before they go to publish those articles. So they kind of get to pick the cream of the crop. And so there is some degree to which journals are a predictor of value. But the red cycle in the bottom is the real problem. And this is the cycle where just because articles get published in a high impact journal, they get attributed with this kind of, you know, quality status, which then encourages people to cite them at higher rates. And that keeps this kind of high impact factor hierarchical system alive and really keeps these journals that we've built into powerful brands like Nature and Science and all of the high impact journals. It keeps them at the top of the hierarchy, and it makes it very difficult for newcomers to dislodge them. So a point in case is any kind of high volume model or even the sort of post-publication peer review models that I highlighted on the previous slide. So think of PLOS ONE, great example. PLOS ONE is making like a good step forward in that it's high volume, and so it's not trying to prioritize impact. So what it means is that anything below a certain bar of, you know, methodological rigor gets published. But at the same time, because it's not being selective, it's not generating prestige in the same way these high impact journals are. And so ultimately what that means within the current social and academic context, PLOS ONE gets relegated to be a sort of lower tier in the journal hierarchy and never really has a chance to displace or disrupt the higher impact journals from their perch. And so at this point, when I make this case, often people say, well, then why don't we just stop paying attention to impact factors? And this is the premise behind the Declaration of Research Assessment, the DORA pledge that many people have taken. And I have taken that pledge and I fully support it. And I wish in a dream state that journal impact factors could just be erased from the face of the planet. Unfortunately, the problem is, even if we stop talking about journal impact factors, reputation and prestige is still going to be a thing that remains for quite some time. And it's going to be an obstacle that's going to be difficult to get over. And so what this model is trying to do is work out a way where we can recognize that fact, but use it to accelerate progress and adoption of a progressive model that could then let us evolve scholarly communication in line with our needs and the principles of science. So the reason that we thought that this could be particularly useful to develop with the PSA is that the model already adopts principles that have been very well adopted in the PSA and shown to be very effective. So those principles, just broadly speaking, are openness, objectivity, decentralization of the review process, and also organizational structure, and crowdsourcing reviews, and also, which I didn't put here, but also using numerical ratings in the review process. Okay, so the next slide is the proposed model. So basically we're proposing a numerical evaluation system, like what Krieger-Skorty has proposed previously. And the basic premise is that articles should be reviewed and rated on a set of predefined qualities. Now, in the top right, I've listed what some of those qualities might be, but obviously these would need to be developed to be relevant for each community of interest. And also we could develop these over time using evidence that I'll talk about later. Now, in terms of when these evaluations get applied, as per the registered report format, we could have an evaluation at the design stage, but the critical sort of stage for this model, at least, is in the write-up stage, so when articles get submitted for publication. So the premise here is that authors would submit to this system and they would agree upfront that their work is going to get published within this system following some kind of a back and forth with the reviewers and editorial team. So it would go to review to the crowd in some manner. There would be reviews and ratings that the authors could then update the manuscript based on and then put it out for a new set of ratings. But at some point, there needs to be a cap between that back and forth, perhaps after, say, X reviews get made, at which the article is then put through for publication. Now, at that point, that brings me to the second point. At that point, the idea here is that we step back from human ratings and we pass it over to algorithms that we've developed as a community. And the goal of those algorithms will be to classify articles into different tiers based on their likely impact. So we could train these algorithms using machine learning techniques on the ratings themselves, but also potentially features of interest that we could test and explore experimentally over the coming years. And then categorize into these different journal bands that get published under different journal names. So a bit tongue-in-cheek, I've called some examples the non-journal of impact Psychology 1 versus the non-journal of impact Psychology 2. And obviously the naming is rubbish, but the idea is that there's some kind of a hierarchy that the articles get published under. And over time, because, well, if our impact predictions are correct, then the articles that make it into these higher tiers should attract more citations and therefore develop more prestige, and then eventually start to tap into this self-maintaining mechanism that maintains high impact factor journals at the top of the hierarchy. So I should stress at this point that the goal is not simply just to replicate the existing journal structure with all of its problems. Yes, the goal is to sort of replicate the structure in that you have this kind of hierarchical system. But the real payoff here, the real benefit, is that at the same time as doing that, we can now get this really rich set of article level data, which we can use to our advantage and start to really empirically test the system and evolve it in line with the principles of science over time. So other things that we could do with this rich data set is beyond just predicting impact. We could predict replicability, like Replicats and Score is trying to do now, but with the added benefit of having these review ratings. We could also think outside the box and start predicting other outcomes of interest. So for example, health outcomes, financial outcomes, basically any kind of real world outcome that might be able to tap into the collective wisdom and knowledge of the research community, we could start to develop algorithms to predict those outcomes. And thinking long term, if we were to increase or get more people into this sort of a system and get more data, more evaluation data from the community, then as this network effect grows, the value of that data that we start collecting gets larger and larger. And long term, I could imagine that that data set could be a very valuable asset that we as a community could start to harness and use to fund a fully open access infrastructure. Because what's talked about, particularly at the moment, is that open access is amazing and it's great, but it has its own collective action problem in that institutions don't have a great incentive to fund an open access infrastructure, because why fund something that other people are creating anyway? It's much easier to just sort of free ride on other people's investments. So to me, what we're doing right now is throwing away all of our peer review expertise and throwing it away to commercial publishers. But if instead we could start to capture that and redirect it back into our community, we could use it to develop a fully open and evidence-based system that then supports us as researchers. And then finally, people might disagree on this, but to me, I think we would be better off if we just dropped the journal label altogether. Journals to me are an outdated system. They made sense when we needed to print things. In the digital age, it would be much better if we could just drop journal titles and move to a kind of flexible suite of algorithms that could be tailored according to each user's needs. But obviously to drop journal titles, we would need some kind of critical mass of people to adopt this type of system. So that's a kind of long-term goal. Okay, so talking about long-term goals, we'll bring it back now to the sort of short term. Obviously what we're proposing is quite speculative. It's long-term in nature. But one thing that really struck me when I started looking into this is just how little data we actually have on the current evaluation system. Editors every day are making desk rejections based on some set of criteria, generally related to impact in some way, but we have really no clear idea about what qualities people are actually rating, and whether those qualities actually do predict impact, or whether researchers can predict impact. And so what Dawn and I are keen to do over the next few years is run a series of experiments that start to tap into this and start to collect data that could then be leveraged to develop the type of model I just described. So the aims of these experiments are to firstly explore what kinds of qualities psychology researchers are interested in. Secondly, how they relate to one another. And then thirdly, which of these actually predict impact in terms of citations. And so a secondary aim at the same time as we're running these experiments would be to try and build the community around these ideas so that we can collaboratively develop this model together and work out together based on the evidence what is the best way to proceed as we move forward, and then hopefully build up a community that is ready to adopt this system if and when there's enough evidence to show that it's going to work. So methods, this is kind of broad overview of the experiments, but some of the methods we're thinking of using are qualitative surveys to determine what qualities people are interested in assessing and what qualities they evaluate when they do peer review. On the experimental side, we're planning to recruit volunteers to rate preprints on a number of different qualities and then explore correlations within and between these ratings and citation counts. And then this is more my background coming in here. So developing machine learning techniques to develop these like impact algorithms and also replicability algorithms based on that rich data set that I described. And so in the short term, what we've written up is the first sort of proof of concept study. Rather than, the model is based around people rating preprints. And that's what we would ideally be moving towards testing. But in the short term, what we thought could be useful is just getting people to rate already published articles that have already accrued some citation counts and start to look at the qualities of interest based on those. And so what we've proposed is that we could get 100 people to rate 400 articles, and just using cursory ratings on impact, novelty, importance, clarity, and replicability, just to primarily to look at what kinds of qualities are related to impact, or at least subjectively people believe are related to impact. And then also to test which of these ratings actually predict impact, and also use a multiple regression technique to do that with the most accuracy as possible. So I think that's kind of the overview. How we're seeing this is we've submitted this first study to the PSA, and so I believe that's undergone review now, or should be nearing completion. And so what we'd love to do is, well, firstly, open it up to you guys, see what you think about the model and the proposal. And then ideally, we'd love to kind of collaborate with everybody in this organization to develop this model as we go forward. Yeah, so I thought I'd throw it over to you first. Does anyone have any questions or comments, criticisms? Everything is welcome. We also have some prompt questions if no one has anything, but I'll give people a chance to pipe up first.
Could I ask a question, Cooper?
Sure. I
am pretty familiar with Octopus because I saw it when it was being presented at the Royal Society, and it's already built up. I mean, it's a modular setup that is live. And I'm just wondering, like, what is, I'm sorry if I missed this a little bit, but like, what is the main purpose of doing evaluation about people's acceptability in a hypothetical sense, as opposed to just throwing our weight behind one of these existing projects?
Sorry, acceptability, is that what you said?
Like, I was just wondering about the goals of like surveying people to understand their motivations and willingness to support different kinds of restructuring of this evaluation and publishing context, versus us just, you know, trying to get that critical mass that you mentioned using one of these existing frameworks.
Definitely. Yeah, and so this kind of, I was going to save this for the end, but alongside this project, we've been developing a platform called Free Knowledge, which is about building a critical mass to kind of inject value into new systems. And so I think we can do that alongside this. I guess, to me, Octopus is a beautiful grand vision that I would love to see happen. It's, to me, a question of how long it's going to take, and whether also it's based on evidence. So my understanding is that the rating system that is kind of this modular rating system has been largely just decided a priori, and that's great as a start. But what I'd love to see is an experimental approach where we can actually test what qualities are most valuable to be rated, and also how they relate to real world outcomes.
You mean, like, if we could determine that people care more about the quality of this aspect, then that gets pushed forward as a part of the rating system that is then more prominent in the overall algorithm.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in this context of what we're proposing, what I think Octopus is lacking potentially is the incentive. Because if you ask the average person, you and I might jump on Octopus, and I happily will when it's, you know, fully featured and ready to go. But the average person doesn't care about changing scholarly publishing. They only care about surviving in academia and getting the recognition for their work.
Yeah.
And so what I can't see in Octopus, or any of these other models even, is a mechanism to generate prestige at the journal level, which is currently, unfortunately, how people are judged. Yeah. And so what I would like to do is just kind of tack that mechanism onto Octopus, or tack it onto numerical open evaluation, using this kind of machine learning technique combined with crowdsource ratings, so that we can give people that incentive to get involved, and then hopefully at some point, attract people to enough people to use the system that it just becomes the norm.
Thank you.
Because,
I think you had to say that twice, but it made sense to me that time. Thanks very much.
Okay, no worries.
This is a question from Ceylon in the chat, which is interesting proposal and model. How will you screen your volunteers? Will you have a prerequisite benchmark like experience reviewing at X number of journals? Do you want me to take that one?
Yeah, sure.
So, I mean, with the experiments, we are actually drawing participants from basically our pool, which is you guys, all of us, like researchers who are involved in the peer review system. And I think one of the metrics we do have to get will be what is people's experience reviewing, so that we can actually try and control for that and see whether that makes a difference to the sort of ratings or evaluations they give in the study.
I wonder though, if the volunteers aren't randomly sampled, is that going to bias the algorithm in some way? For example, if the values of, say, if PSA members are disproportionately the inputs into this algorithm, we have a set of values that isn't representative of values at large.
Dawn, do you want to take that? Because you brought that up in the proposal.
Yeah. Well, I think that is definitely a sort of self-selection problem, in which that people who are more predisposed to push it, like helping this sort of thing, are going to be more likely to volunteer. But I think aside from PSA volunteers, we will need to like reach out more into different institutions and do our best to get different levels. But yes, that is going to be one limitation that if anyone has any feedback on what's the best way to overcome that, it'd be great to get it, because again, it is really hard to get good data on this, but we do need that data to be able to understand, well, how do we formulate a good evaluation system?
Yeah, so one way we were thinking we could try and control for that or test for it is, in addition to drawing people from the PSA, we could also draw people just from the broader psychology community, and then test within the set whether that's affecting people's ratings. So we could potentially control for it that way and just check that it's not biasing the sample. Any other thoughts, critiques?
Well, if there aren't, maybe we can move on to our questions that we're going to get feedback on.
The prompts.
I mean, I think we're especially interested in knowing what qualities of interest there are about publishable, well, papers of impact, because one thing that really gets to me is that, well, we don't really have a well-defined notion of value. Like if you ask maybe 10 different researchers, so what makes a really valuable, impactful article, you might get 10 different answers. So that's a question for everyone. Like what are the qualities that really determine how impactful an article is, or what should be the qualities that determine it? Because these are the measures that we're going to want to capture.
Two potentially very different things.
This is Cameron again. I think quality is easiest to talk about when we have something like inferential, empirical work that's trying to do hypothesis testing. Then we can say, okay, these methods lead to good inferences and those don't. In general, like how you would define quality for a theory article, boy, that sounds really tough. I'm not sure.
It sounds like you're saying that for different types of articles, we might need to develop different metrics that best define quality. So like looking at, well, yes, empirical papers, that's what we're going to start with, but then we might need to look into it for theory articles later down the line as well.
I think for me that's right. Like it might be important for a theory article to do some integration or synthesis or some new insight of some kind, whatever those words mean. But for an empirical article, merely demonstrating an effect without much interpretation might be sufficiently high quality to get a high rating for me.
Yeah,
Yeah,
No, go ahead.
no, that makes sense. I was just going to say that, like, akin to what was brought up with octopus down earlier, to me, like an ideal system is some kind of a rating system that is for experimental research, separated by research stage. And to speak to your example of like an empirical finding that is of interest, you could break up the evaluation process according to the different stages, so that you've got some idea about what is like high quality at the design stage, but then also some idea about what is of potential interest at the result stage. But yeah, it's a really good point that different research will need different systems. And we're definitely in the early days thinking that this is much easier and we'll get traction with experimental studies. I think that just makes sense.
Yeah.
I haven't even thought what to do with theory papers or anything.
I don't even know how to write one, so I'm not sure how to rate them either.
That is a struggle.
Well, I suppose in that case, novelty might come up more than if it's experimental, because replication studies are really important as well. So you might actually class novelty more for theory articles, for example, as in the novelty of new synthesis or whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, I guess at the end of the day, if we have an outcome of interest, which under the current system is citations, then, and we have qualities that people are rating on, then we should be able to predict those outcomes based on those ratings and other potential features of the articles. But yeah, I think it makes sense to start with experimental studies because they're so much more controlled and organized than the theory papers.
Maybe put a question out there. What do people think about ecological validity as a quality?
Good question.
No, I'm just asking because like this other thing I work with is looking at trying to help policy with research, and so policy impact rates things in a very different way from the way we rate research impact, and I just wondered, is there room for that sort of thing, and should we be addressing it?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think, sorry, did someone have an answer there?
I was just wondering if anyone's looked at the grade, rating system for research quality, or the Cochrane collaboration kind of frameworks, because they do rate articles, for example, in medicine, on a whole huge set of criteria that I think are pretty well thought through.
No, I hadn't. Sounds like they're leagues ahead of us in that regard, at least.
I don't know if it fits the whole range of articles that we have, but for some articles, they've thought a lot about the components.
Systematic literature reviews, I think, and meta-analyses have a certain format they have to follow.
There are a bunch of grading formats, but I didn't mean to pun there, sorry. But the grade is my favorite of them.
Okay.
Thanks, I'll check that out for sure. But then also, I think, Dawn, you mentioned or brought up about kind of other outcomes of interest that grant agencies might be interested in. And to me, this is the real kicker. Like I said before, if we have an outcome of interest, some variable, then we should be able to predict it based on the data set that we can develop. And there are all kinds of real world impacts that we're not measuring right now. And all the current system seems to care about is citations. But what is the good of citations if it has no real impact in the world? And so what I'd like to see is us to start using our combined expertise to predict these real world outcomes so that we can actually start to, work out what research is having the biggest impact, what research is saving lives, what research is, improving the economy or whatever the outcome might be. So I feel like that this system could have potential to sort of redirect our focus in some good ways, potentially. I also think, unless there's any other questions, I probably should wrap up because I think we only had until 10 past. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's
the chat. Okay, so I've got, okay, yeah, so that's all the questions. So yeah, so this is just the last slide basically. So if you are interested, we'd absolutely love to hear from you. We're going to need a lot of participants. And at a minimum, we're just asking people to read and rate 2 articles. So if that's something you feel you could commit to, please get in touch. When the platform does go live, we'll be hosting it on the Free Our Knowledge platform that I mentioned before. For anyone that's not aware, this is a collective action platform that is live. Don't know if I can share my screen. Anyway, if you check it out, it's freeourknowledge.org. Basically, the idea is that any researcher can create a campaign that needs some kind of a critical mass to go ahead. You put it out to the crowd, people sign up, and then when you get to that threshold, then everybody takes on the action that was pre-specified in the campaign. And so the main idea of the platform was to try and solve this collective action problem in academia and motivate us to move forward with progressive open science behaviors. But we're just going to leverage it for this study. And this is another use case for the platform. If you need X people to participate in a study, then you can get them to sign up via this platform. And the study will go ahead when we've got enough people that have signed up. So we're still just finishing the development of that particular aspect for this campaign. So in the meantime, please just get in touch via email and we can put you on the list when it goes live. And yeah, and here are some ways that I'm not just participating. If you'd love to collaborate with people on this. And so there's all these different kinds of studies that we could run, and also currently trying to think about funding and ways that we could win some funding for this line of research. So yeah, I think that's it from us, and thank you for listening.